This morning, we're going to talk about bringing human rights home. What does that title even mean? I know that in my work, when I say to people that this is a human rights organization and that our framework is human rights, I get that glazed look. And then the question, in the United States? Human rights are so often thought of as something we talk about in other countries, and often in terms of violations. Today we're going to talk about changing some of that national conversation to bring human rights home. We have three amazing panelists who are going to tell you a little bit about themselves, and I'm going to invite them up to the stage now. Please. That worked so much better in my mind. Much better too. I didn't see you before. I'm going to take one moment to say thank you to Louie, who has been here for years and years and years, memorializing every summit. Thank you, Louie. How far in did you fall when you sat down? Oh, it is not bad.
It's like a really tall one,
Yes.
Another.
Kind of, yes. Jill, let's start with you.
Okay. Is this on? No. What do I do? Just talk. Yes, you're right. It's on. Okay, thanks. Hi, my name's Jill McCracken. I am a professor of rhetoric, English, writing studies, and gender and sexuality studies. I work at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. I am also the co-founder and co-director of the Sex Workers Outreach Project Behind Bars, SWAP Behind Bars. Alex Andrews is the brain of the operation. Thank you. It's been an amazing, amazing opportunity to be a part of SWAP Behind Bars, to create it, and to be involved as it's grown. It's only since 2016. So I am the co-founder, co-director of that. I am a single parent, and I use she, her pronouns. And I was on the founding board of SWAP USA, so I've been around for a while, and I've watched the sex worker rights movement grow, which has been really exciting, and it's really exciting to see it take a more formal part of Woodhull. I haven't been to Woodhull in quite a few years, so it's nice to be back, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Cynthia.
Hey everyone, good morning. Okay, who slept more than 6 hours last night? Raise your hand. Oh, not bad. Okay. Should have asked the other way around. Okay, hi, I'm Cynthia Rothschild. I'd like to know who's awake in the room and who's not. My name is Cynthia Rothschild. I'm based in New York. First, I'd like to thank Ricky. I'd like to thank Carmen for your invitation to join you today. It's really rare for groups within the United States to articulate a human rights framework, bold and upfront, and that's part of what excites me about being here today, and it makes me appreciate you and Woodhull, so thank you. I have been engaged in human rights advocacy for about 25 years, mostly through a lens of sexuality, gender. I cut my political teeth in the human rights movement. And I've somehow managed to build a career of linking sexuality and human rights. Sometimes I don't know how that's happened. Part of my work is demystifying the UN and demystifying the UN's human rights system. And I like to think that part of what I do is I bring a feminist queer revolution to to that bureaucracy. I've been attending the UN's Human Rights Council since its inception in 2006. I've also been connected to meetings in New York for within the UN system for close to 20 years. And historically, I helped to build Amnesty's international focus on LGBT issues, starting from the early 1990s. I come to the space as a dyke activist. I'm a trainer and facilitator and writer, including on issues of U.S. sexuality policy and also global attacks on what we call civil society space, so attacks on organizing. I also want to acknowledge the fierce history of activism and human rights work of folks in this room, some of whom are on this panel. So thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you. RJ.
Good morning, everyone. My name's RJ Thompson. I use he, him, and his pronouns. I am a queer, pansexual, polyamorous, indigenous activist, human rights lawyer, and a longtime sex worker in multiple parts of the sex trades. Have been involved off and on with Woodhull as a volunteer and consultant and friend for several years, so it's great to see the summit grow, and very, very thankful to be back again this year. I currently am the managing director of the Sex Workers Project and the Human Rights Project at the Urban Justice Center in New York. Those are two of the 8 projects that make up UJC, the Urban Justice Center. And the Sex Workers Project has been around since 2001. Human Rights Project about similar in age as well. I've worked in several movements for social justice and always brought the human rights framework and strategies to those movements, whether it be reproductive justice, anti-racism work, restaurant worker rights, sex worker rights, LGBT rights, and other movements, death penalty abolition as well. So very happy to be here, and I hope that we can, as Cynthia said, demystify some things, make hopefully some theoretical things tangible and practical, and yeah, I also live in New Orleans and Jersey City, so if anyone's from those 2 areas, holler at me.
Thank you. So you know me, I always have something to say, right? Many, 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 many years ago, when I began this work, I wasn't familiar with the initials that stood for many, 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 many things. I knew RJ. We were working together on building bridges. Causes in common, no bridge. No bridge. But I knew RJ, and I figured I'll learn all the rest. And I was looking at a document, and every other word was RJ, 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 and I thought, oh my God, he must be so important. He's like all over this document. When I mentioned it to him, he said, reproductive justice.
That's really funny.
It was.
That's very funny.
I have a lot
Racial
of trouble
justice
with
too.
initials.
That's hilarious.
Cynthia, would you begin, please, and talk to us about human rights?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Ricky. I had no idea you were going to ask me that. No, just kidding.
We did rehearse that.
Yeah. Okay. So first, I'm going to hit on a few topics, including concrete examples, but I also want to help lift the conversation in terms of what we're actually talking about when we talk about a human rights frame. Because people use human rights differently, we mean different things when we say it. But overall, and travel with me in this, the value of using a human rights framework is that it places us within an international context. And Ricky said something really important before, that generally within the United States, we are trained to think that human rights is about something that happens outside of US borders. I want to challenge that, and I want to challenge that because we need to be thinking of ourselves as in solidarity and having the same experiences as people outside of the U.S. I'm not going to say more about that right now, but again, big picture. Human rights system is a system of accountability. It's generally about government to government, but it's also about individuals in relationship to their governments. It's a way of challenging impunity. It's a means of saying, you can't get away with this, or we deserve better, or we deserve more. Human rights the framework is bestowed to all people. It's the great equalizer. We have human rights by virtue of being human. And that's an important, it's an important thing to keep remembering. So with a human rights framework, we make demands of the state and the people who comprise the state. And we basically are saying, we have a right to this, or we have a right to be free from like torture or the death penalty, right? So it's a right to, and it's a right specifically to be free from. And governments have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. I want to just, oh, look at that, that's good. I didn't expect that there. Okay. I want to say also that we're having this conversation today in a context of a geopolitical climate around the world that is actually terrible for human rights. There are vehement attacks on the human rights system. We're in a situation globally where there are attacks on dissent, opposition, protests. I mean, every day you look in the paper, and I mean, yesterday it was Zimbabwe. There was a terrible crackdown on a daily effort in the United States. It's the same thing. There's surveillance of organizations. Offices are getting harassed, broken into. There's much more to say about that, but I just want to position the discussion in that climate. In terms of a human rights analysis and using the tools of human rights, I want to say a little bit more about what that's about. It doesn't require being at the UN, it doesn't require being in Geneva or New York, and it doesn't require knowing all the big picture details. You don't have to recite details of treaties. But part of what its value is that it places us in an international context of social justice struggles. And it is about our claims to righting wrongs, to calling out, stopping, and preventing violence, and preventing discrimination and threats to dignity and security. It's about documenting, and it's about telling the stories of the context of our lives and realities. It is about creating, strengthening, or changing policy. And it's about holding individuals and systems accountable. It's about changing attitudes, including cultural change generally, and the attitudes of police or military and judicial systems. I want to say a drop more about solidarity. This is the work and the frame that links us to the struggles of Moses's comrades in Uganda. I don't know if Moses is still here, fighting for the rights of LGBT people and against politicians and media who use anti-gay rhetoric as electoral issues. That happens here as well. Malala in Pakistan, fighting against violence against women and girls and for girls' education. Greta in Sweden, the young activist who's taking the world by storm to challenge climate change and environmental disaster due to capitalism run amok and neoliberal policy. This links us to sex workers and amazing organizing in India. It puts us in solidarity also with Berta Cáceres in Honduras, a land and indigenous people's rights activist, and Marielle Franco, a dynamic politician in Brazil who fought for rights of women, poor, and queer people and sex workers, and they were both gunned down in recent years because of their activism and their demands. Okay. How human rights organizing appears in the U.S. These are a couple of quick examples. Others will go also into more detail. But I think it's important to note that people within the United States, activists within the United States, have been advocating using a human rights framework for well over 20 years. We're not starting, right, with humility, we're not starting this struggle in this moment. In San Francisco in the late 1990s, the city of San Francisco, as a result of feminist organizing, actually adopted an ordinance that adopted the principles of the treaty known as CEDAW, which in short is the Women's Treaty. It's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So the city actually, in essence, adopted CEDAW, right? Because the country, i.e. the United States, still has not. There have been 187-ish countries that have ratified CEDAW. The United States is not one of them. So San Francisco adopted it, which was really creative and allowed for great coalition organizing and exciting work. In the mid-2000s in New York City, there was a project called the Human Rights Initiative that sought to do something simpler, except here, and for the first time, organizers tried to link CEDAW, the Women's Convention, with the treaty that focuses on racial discrimination. The acronym is CERD. It's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. So for the first time, they took gender and race, and there was a coalition of over 100 New York City NGOs, some represented in this room, that actually fought to have a New York City ordinance that would adopt CEDAW and CERD. Now, that didn't work because there wasn't the political will within New York City Council ultimately to commit to a human rights framework, but they got so far, and it was so close, and it was really a beautiful thing. There's an effort called Cities for CEDAW now, which is deeper on local organizing. I'm gonna stop by naming a few quick additional things that are opportunities, and I'll say more about this in the end. I hear someone's alarm. Okay, give me one more minute on this. There are special rapporteurs and independent experts within the UN system who do country visits. They can they can come to the United States. Some have. The special rapporteur on poverty came to the US last year and issued a scathing report. He was so smart. He had reporters travel with him, and they did a lot of public work exposing the U.S. in relation to poverty. Brilliant work. It's possible to work with the special rapporteurs. It's also possible to engage in a process called the Universal Periodic Review, which both Jill and RJ are going to say more about. I want to flag first that there are people in this room who've been engaged in that process. So RJ, Jill, Ricky, Monica, Kate. That is a system, I'm just going to define it. It's a system of the UN's Human Rights Council through which governments review one another's human rights records, right? And states don't like to be called out by other states. So it ends up being quite complicated, but states will make specific recommendations to another state, and they'll say, hey, you ought to be better at this, or you ought to be better at that. And then the state under review can say, I accept that recommendation, I reject it, or I'm going to ignore it and pretend you never said it, which certainly happens. The UPR comes up for the United States again in 2020, so the moment is now to contribute to that. It creates great coalition opportunities, and we'll hear more about that work.
Excuse me. I want to know how, in 10 years of this Sexual Freedom Summit, you have not had a conversation about circumcision, male genital mutilation, as a human rights review.
I have. Yes.
I've been in discussions within Amnesty about that issue.
I submitted proposals to this summit year after year on circumcision, always denied. As soon as I submitted one as a sex worker parent, immediately. Every time I've submitted as a sex worker, I've gotten a thumbs up. This isn't a conversation that's been having here. I haven't heard it. I've asked around, I've asked everyone. Anyway, I want to interrupt because this is a really serious topic.
Okay. So the first Universal Periodic Review took place in Geneva, and one of the things that was accomplished there, Woodhull was very proud to be a part of. RJ, as the director of our human rights program at that time, traveled to Geneva, and I know that RJ is going to talk about this, aren't you? Okay, yes. The United States has to agree to monitor something or to address it. What we got through was recommendation 86. For some reason, I always want to say 69. Recommendation 86, that says that violence against sex workers is a human rights violation. Yeah. I think you were next, right?
Okay.
There's your lead-in.
Sure. Thank you, Ricky. Thanks, Cynthia, for teeing this all up. So, a few things. I want to acknowledge the person who just spoke. Thank you for raising it. I think that male circumcision is absolutely an invisible issue in terms of dialogue in this country. I often make linkages between, while they are different experiences, the human rights violations that intersex folks experience and female genital cutting, both here and abroad. That does happen in the United States. My friend has an organization that's specifically focused on female genital cutting in the US, but male circumcision is absolutely something that continues to be normalized in this country when most of the world does not. And so I know that there are organizations working on it in the UN system, including one that's based in Berkeley. I'm happy to talk more afterwards, but thank you for raising it. That comes to the issue of the human right to bodily autonomy, that we all have bodily autonomy, whether we are engaging in sex work, whether it comes to, unnecessary surgeries on infants. We have bodily autonomy as one of our many, many human rights. I want to thank Ricky and Woodhull, staff, board, and volunteers. I want to say that the reason I continue to believe in Woodhull's mission as critical, when there are so many organizations we could choose to support in this country in so many movements and so many issues, is that Woodhull is absolutely unique and special at the intersections of sexual freedom and human rights. And despite the pushback, Ricky and the organization have not succumbed to any pressure about hiding from a human rights framework, and instead have continued to educate and lift it up for our communities from the grassroots local level to the international level, which are all connected. So I want to thank you, Ricky and Woodhull, for that. The only way that a human rights culture will happen in this country is if we all build it, brick by brick, day by day, dialogue by dialogue with our friends, family, colleagues, comrades. I believe that's where human rights change starts. And I also want to say Woodhull's really important because I've worked in the LGBT, reproductive justice, and sex worker rights movement, and I see a commonality of desexualization of our movements over the past 22 years that I've been engaged in organizing and activism. This happens for legitimacy reasons and assimilation reasons and funding reasons, and it's problematic. And I want to thank Woodhull for being front and center, talking about sex and sexuality and gender and the intersections of those things as human rights issues. We talk in the Sex Workers Project about worker rights being human rights, and they absolutely are. And we're a worker rights organization, we're a migrant rights organization, we're a racial justice organization, but we're also a sexual rights organization. And even in the sex worker rights movement, I see some hesitate to focus on issues of sexual rights, and sometimes perhaps out of fear that is centering a framework of the privileged, and I also want to push back on that sexual rights, bodily autonomy, self-determination are key to marginalized people's struggles. They're key to indigenous people's struggles, to racial justice struggles, to struggles against poverty, and working class and poor people's struggles, and that is not an issue of the privileged. While we see how it plays out, right, in privilege within our movements, I just want to name that all of these things are critical, and one thing the human rights framework gives us is that no human rights can exist without the others. It's inherently intersectional and interdependent, which is one reason I've embraced it for over 15 years. How many of us live single issue or single identity lives in this room? Right? We as human beings are complicated, multifaceted beings. And the human rights framework seeks to lift up all of ourselves, our spiritual selves, if we consider ourselves spiritual, our sexual selves, our political, our social, our economic selves. And that, the right to vote may not mean much if you don't have food on the table. All human rights are indispensably interdependent. So, I want to also say that we need to start thinking bigger than ourselves. I have 22 years of movement experience in about 7 movements. And one thing I see over and over in the United States, or 2 things I'll name, is a mimicked or unintentionally replicated isolationism and exceptionalism. So we critique the exceptionalism of our government, but we replicate exceptionalism and isolationism within our movements, within our communities, within our identities. And the human rights framework that some people will push back and say is identity blind is absolutely not identity blind. As Cynthia said, there are gender treaties, there are race treaties. We have special rapporteurs for indigenous peoples' issues, for sexuality issues, and so forth. But what it is a common, that there is something about our lives and about our rights that is greater than any one of our identities or individual experiences. Even in the African system, there's human and people's rights, right? So it considers the rights of the collective, of peoples. We have to think bigger than our silos. We talk about that all the time, but do we really? I was at an LGBT fundraiser where one of our friend organizations, the National LGBTQ Task Force, just yesterday in 2019, we're still? 2019. In 2019, was asked, why do you all work on abortion rights, reproductive justice? And it was a gay male crowd, not surprisingly, it was Fire Island, and they had a great response that, to keep it, there's many, many reasons, right? But on a very basic level, we care about human rights, and we have not just male-identified people in our community, just on a very basic level, right? So highlighting how self-interested the question is, or why do you work on immigration, right? And a queer person of color who was an immigrant was able to say racism doesn't stop at the gay bar door, and sometimes it starts there, right? So these are things we all, or many of us know, but I really want to just say that the human rights framework gives us an opportunity to make linkages and coalitions that we don't otherwise necessarily make so easily. And also that, civil rights, which are thought of as domestic, and human rights as international, are not separate. Civil rights are human rights. Civil rights are human rights just like economic rights, sexual rights, social rights, and so forth. But we've been taught by an intentional history in this country, by the way, please read the book Eyes Off the Prize by Carol Anderson, an intentional, purposeful history of ignoring economic and social rights like health, housing, work, healthcare, education, because this government does not want to question status quo capitalism. And because they do that by conflating it with socialism and communism. Human rights says you can have different political or economic systems and still safeguard human rights. So, it doesn't matter what party you belong to, but economic and social rights are key, crucial elements of struggle in this country that without addressing, we are not going to get very far. And since the 1950s, NGOs in this country have been pushed to narrow their focus to civil rights only, very purposefully. If we don't address issues like climate change and nuclear abolition, and have no planet to live on, what does LGBT rights or racial justice even for that matter really mean? We have to think bigger than ourselves while lifting up our identities and experiences at the same time. Very quickly, a couple very tangible ways that we do this. At the Sex Workers Project, we try to implement a human rights culture in our values, talk about human rights with our clients. We do direct social and legal service work with sex workers and survivors of trafficking. And our clients become empowered when they understand that they have rights by virtue of their birth, by virtue of their being human. These are people that have experienced high levels of trauma, repeated things things you can't imagine some of our clients have experienced. And for them to internalize that they have rights, whether those rights are violated or not, has been very powerful. In a second tangible way, lawyers across this country have used human rights arguments in state and local courts. A resource to check out is Human Rights in State Courts from the Opportunity Agenda. It goes issue by issue with arguments lawyers have made to try to build human rights jurisprudence and legal culture in this country Because again, when lawyers tell me, well, judges aren't going to listen to human rights-based arguments, and I tell them, yeah, they never will if we don't try it, right? Jurisprudence changes. We have to be, movement lawyers are the ones that have to make those arguments, just like organizers have to push the framework. And finally, with the UPR that Ricky segued me into, we had great success in 2010, not so much in terms of policy change, though we were able to have high-level conversations with US government agencies because of that recommendation that was made, but even more so as a movement-building opportunity to bring together a very fractured, wounded movement, the sex worker rights movement, that has its own internal struggles, right? And that movement moment really brought many of us together across different frames and identities as sex workers that are so extremely diverse in our experience and our privilege and our identities. So I want to, whether you're an organizer, a social worker, a lawyer, a parent, a teacher, whatever your role is in life, your roles, plural, if you're interested in engaging, there's a place for you, and you can talk to any one of us about how to engage in next year's process.
Thank you so much, RJ. So, Jill, I know you have something prepared, but would you begin by explaining to anyone who might not know the role of a special rapporteur? That's what I
Rapporteur?
meant, yes.
Rapporteur?
I did say it right, rapporteur.
Yeah.
Yeah, would you
Yeah.
explain that? I did.
In my understanding, and I would hope that people would correct me if I misspeak, my understanding of the special rapporteur is that their job is to come around and communicate with different organizations on the ground and get a sense of what is actually happening. So when we were involved in the UPR 86 process, which I was also involved, and there were so many people involved that I cannot name them all. I know that RJ and others have named some of the people, Cynthia, sorry. So Ricky, I was getting all ready for my thing, and then you just threw me off. It's okay. So the rapporteur comes around, and it's a really great opportunity for organizations and just individuals on the ground to be able to talk about the lived experience of, in this case, sex workers and violence that was being done against sex workers on a daily basis, right? And so that's their job, is to then collect those stories and bring them back to the powers that be. Is that a safe explanation or a good explanation?
Yeah, I can add later.
Okay,
Add later? Okay, cool.
now you can do your thing. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I said earlier that I'm an English professor and a rhetoric professor, which is my area of expertise. I also have been doing research on prostitution, sex work, and trafficking for the last 15 years. So that's my primary area. But in thinking about this panel, I wanted to think about human rights and social justice from a broader perspective. I kind of get narrowed into my own perspective. I want to just highlight really quickly that rhetoric, Aristotle, you may associate Aristotle, and this is not an English lesson here necessarily, but Aristotle talked about the art of persuasion. And I define rhetoric as the way that language and images shape the world that we live in. So, for instance, our bathrooms. We have little pictures of little male persons and little pictures of people in dresses, and so we know supposedly which room to walk into to go to the bathroom. Those images and the language, even gender, shapes the world that we live in. And it's shifting. Our language has shifted tremendously. And so now when someone walks up to us, we don't always necessarily need to put them in one of the two gender boxes, right? It's complex and it's messy and it's really beautiful. And I think that that's what I want to think about when it comes to human rights. So we can look at the language that we're using, and we can look at the underlying belief systems or the underlying ideologies, and then we can bring that to the forefront when we have conversations. So I want to talk just briefly about a couple of different projects that I've had the privilege and honor of working on, because I think it makes it, at least for me, it makes it much more concrete. And so I was asked to be research something, I can't remember, for the Human Rights Coalition, and they actually created a report called Living at Risk, and it was based on Black trans women in Florida, primarily in South Florida, in Miami and Fort Lauderdale, and they had Black trans women going out and asking questions about what are the issues that Black trans women are facing. And they then created this report. And they didn't have a lot of funding, and I did not, it wasn't a paid consulting thing by any stretch. They didn't have a lot of funding, but what they were able to do, and I'm gonna have to read this because Megan McLemore was the director on the project, and they created the report, and since the report has been published, which just came out, and it's called Living at Risk, there have been like 1,400 views, 2,200 views, they have a YouTube thing. But since this report has been published, members of the Human Rights Watch are working with trans and HIV activists in Miami and Fort Lauderdale to meet with the State Department of Health about implementing the report recommendations. So you know how we have these reports and then we have recommendations. The HIV program director at the Department of Health presented the report's findings at the statewide HIV council meeting in April in Tampa and agreed to form the first ever statewide task force comprised of trans advocates living with HIV from all 67 counties in Florida to work on implementing the recommendations, including an initial focus on data collection improvements, offering hormone medications on the ADAP formulary, and ensuring training in all Ryan White funded clinics statewide. So this is just one little small project, but it's actually having an impact on the state of Florida as a whole. And if you don't know Florida, which I've lived there for 12 years and I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. If you don't, oh, yeah. If you don't know Florida, aside from our vacatur laws, if you are a certified victim of trafficking or have experienced exploitation in the sex industry, we have really beautiful vacatur laws that you can vacate prostitution laws, prostitution charges, but also others like theft, anything that's not incredibly violent, we can vacate those. Incredible. The state of New York doesn't have that. They're working on it. So other than that, Florida is terrible. Sorry if you live there and love it, but whatever, we're from there, RJ. But I will say this is a concrete situation where we had this question about trans women and their health issues. A report was created, there's recommendations, and now we actually can have conversations with the Department of Health in Tampa about implementing this in the state of Florida. So again, it starts small, but I guess what I want to talk about in general is we can take these questions or these ideas, and I'm a researcher, so I like to think through these things and say, how can we bring in evidence-based research that we can then try to change people's minds? And at the forefront, at the ground, we're talking about human rights. And in this case, we're talking about, with living at risk, we're talking about sexuality, but we're just talking about living our lives and exposure to HIV, and all of these, as RG said, all of these intersecting issues. So that's one example. I had the privilege, incredible privilege, which is where I want to live, to go to New Zealand. And I know this is not New Zealand, unfortunately. But what I want to talk about briefly is the Prostitution Reform Act, which they passed in 2003. And I printed it out because I knew I couldn't state it, and I lost my glasses last night, so that's a challenge as well. If you find the red framed glasses, please let me know. So the Prostitution Reform Act was passed in 2003. That's 16 years ago, okay? They were working on this for a very long time, and it only passed by one vote. It was not a slam dunk, so to speak. I don't use sports metaphors. But the purpose of this act, and listen, I want the language to become apparent. The purpose of this act is to decriminalize prostitution while not endorsing or morally sanctioning prostitution or its use, in quote, in parentheses, and to create a framework that A, safeguards the human rights of sex workers and protects them from exploitation. So that's number one. That's the thing. So what they did here, rhetorically, is they took this huge issue about prostitution and they said, look, we're not going to sanction it morally. No, don't worry about that. We just want to protect people's human rights. And since that's been passed, it's incredible. I mean, the police, and I had the opportunity, I went on a Fulbright and I was there for 3 months, and I did research with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, who were directly working with the government to make this happen. And again, we're not New Zealand, it's a very different culture in a different place. But since that happened 15 years ago, the police are driving around, street-based sex work is decriminalized, independent sex work is decriminalized, and brothel is decriminalized. It's all decriminalized. And the cops will drive by, and the people are working on the street, and they're like, hey, how's it going? And they're like, oh, we're good. Have you seen so-and-so? Do. I mean, they will actually go. 75% of the people that I spoke with said they would actually go to the police. They don't want to go to the police. Stigma, discrimination, still very much alive and well, but they would go to the police. So again, I want to just emphasize, and I know I'm out of time as well, I want to emphasize that if we can look at our language and we can look at our belief systems and we can frame things in the way that we can say, you know what, this doesn't have to be about morality. This doesn't have to be about saying we're all going to go out and be sex workers, although that would be kind of cool. It just is about values and beliefs. And I do think the general public in the US can get behind that. Whether it's LGBT, reproductive justice, that we want people to be safe and alive, and we need to think about all of these things. And I think we can frame our arguments from that perspective, which is what the human rights framework gets us.
Thank you. Washington, D.C. had a temporary measure for prostitution-free zones. We renamed those constitution-free zones. In those zones, all of your constitutional protections are gone. A policeman doesn't have to have a reason to pick you up. It could be because he or she just has a feeling that you might be thinking that maybe you're a sex worker. So we testified, Woodhull testified, I did, at the hearing for prostitution-free zones. And I did, by the way, in that testimony say constitution-free. At the end of the session, I went up and I spoke to the then chair of the DC Council. And I thought I was going to get some major pushback. I had framed everything as a human rights violation. And the person said to me, "Thank you so much for making this a human rights issue. It's an election year, and none of us could afford to be pro-sex work, but we could all be pro-human rights." Thank you. Yeah. I've had wonderful experiences like that. And what each panelist this morning has talked to you about is tangible ways to bring human rights into whatever you're doing. Yes, in the court, you can't really raise human rights, but you can. You can raise anything you want.
Yeah, I want to say, as the lawyer in me has to point out, the U.S. Constitution itself says that international treaties are the supreme law of the land alongside the U.S. Constitution, and they should supersede any contravening state or local or even federal law. So at least lawyers and judges should know that, right? But that clause of the Constitution gets ignored all the time.
Among other clauses. So, yes, you can open your mouth and talk about human rights in a court or in a police station or wherever you find yourself. And I like to remind people that there was a time in our history where you could not be tried for murdering, raping, hanging a person of color until somebody said, we're going to talk about this and we're going to bring it into court and we're going to change it. You were going to say something more, Cynthia, about special rapporteur.
Yeah, just quickly in response to your question, there are UN independent experts. They're called special rapporteurs. There's something called a working group, and these are also comprised of independent experts. These are either individuals or small committees. This is much more complicated than I'm making it, that focus on specific themes or specific countries. For the special rapporteurs in particular, there are, I used to know the number, there are close to 50 independent experts. So that means between the countries and the specific themes, and the themes, there's an independent expert, which is basically the same thing as a special rapporteur. on sexual orientation and gender identity. There's a special rapporteur on housing. There's a special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, on the death penalty, on freedom of expression, on and on. It's those sorts of themes. And then there would be a special rapporteur on Iran or Sudan or any list of countries. And they issue reports after they do their investigation. They do official country visits, which is a complicated process, but one to keep in mind. And when they do their country visits, they meet with organizations, and they're researchers, and they compile a report. The end of each report, there's a series of recommendations, and I'll say more when we get to our next full round, but we collectively need to be much better at using the recommendations in creative ways, because they issue really, really, mostly very smart reports with very straightforward recommendations about what a government has to do and what civil society has to do, and we could be doing really creative campaigning around those recommendations.
Also, another anecdote around early on in my activist life, earlier on, how I learned that it was so important for us as U.S., even local advocates to engage in these international mechanisms is because I was working at the LGBT Community Center in New York, where I met Ricky, who was doing Causes in Common, reproductive justice and LGBT coalition work. Only because our staff had an interest, we went to the United Nations conference called World Fit for Children, plus 5 or 10, I don't remember what it was, but we went because we're in New York, it's the UN's in our backyard. There's some human rights opportunities to engage there without going to Geneva. So we said, okay, let's go, because we had an LGBT families program that my good friend Terry Bogus founded, and then we had an LGBT youth program, right? So we're like, okay, children's rights, absolutely relevant to our work here at the center. The center didn't understand why we would go to the UN, but that's another story for another day. But when we went, we were told to our faces, Terry as a lesbian mom was told by US government officials at the time, Bush appointees, mind you, but that there are no, I'm sure they said gay, not LGBT, gay children, and there are no gay parents. So this is several years ago, right? But it's in the 2000s, so come on. But the reason, besides just being ignorant, that they were saying that is they told us, we've never heard from you before, because our response was, right, no, we were queer kids and/or I am a queer parent. And they said, well, we've never heard that before. We hear from, I said, who have you been talking to? The NGOs are Concerned Women of America, the Traditional Values Coalition, Focus on the Family. Because one thing the right does very well in this country, among many things that they do better than we do, is many of their NGOs are not ignorant to the UN mechanisms, and they engage with them. And so that was a really powerful moment for me, where I was like, where are our national organizations here? We're a community center, right? And just doing this because we want to. But, I really called out our national LGBT organizations that there's more than just local, state, and national in the world. And when it comes to human rights, if we're not speaking for ourselves, I guarantee you somebody's speaking for you.
If you're not sitting at the table, you're probably on the menu. We need to be sitting at the table. So we asked people at the beginning of the summit, as they go through their workshops and their time here, to submit questions for the panel. And I'm going to just kind of play on what we've been talking about and read 2 questions, because I'm a quick learner. Governments around the world have been blithely ignoring the Universal Declaration of Human Rights since 1948. The UN has not been able to implement or enforce it. What steps can we take to change this? And that goes with, I know we need both cultural change and legislative change. If we're going to really protect human rights, I know we need both cultural change and legislative change if we are going to protect human rights. How should organizations or individuals advocate these with limited resources? It feels overwhelming. Jill.
Yeah, it absolutely is overwhelming. What I would say is speaking out about it again and again and again. I'm thinking about things like the legislative change that's just happened in the state of California, where sex workers have immunity now because if they are, and I'm not saying this is going to switch overnight, but if you're not familiar, the law was passed, which I was interviewed by a reporter, and they were like, we needed a law to pass that said sex workers, if they are a victim of a crime, can go to the police. Like, we actually had to pass a law to say that? And I said, yeah, because they'll be arrested for what they're doing. So speaking about these issues again and again and again, I am not trying to make SWAT Behind Bars the end-all be-all by any stretch. The SWAT Behind Bars was just sort of a brainstorm that Alex and I came up with. But I have to tell you, speaking about the intersection of the people who are most disproportionately affected by our criminalization of prostitution laws, they don't know about the sex worker rights movement. And we were basically just trying to say, what can we learn from them? And what can they learn from us? And how can we create some community? And it blew up. And we are in a space right now where a lot of people are talking about incarceration and criminal legal reform. So again, having these conversations and actually pulling from the intersections, yes, resources are small, but because we actually pulled sex worker rights groups and anti-incarceration groups and criminal legal reform groups, yeah, we have more resources that we can use. And we also just created a newsletter and talked to people in the prisons, right? And they're speaking to us, and we have pen pals. And again, it's not about the SWAT Behind Bars. It's about this little tiny thing that just became huge that a lot of people are now able to talk about and participate in. Gigi Thomas is, you may know Gigi Thomas. She's a local activist. She's in prison right now. We actually talked about doing a letter writing campaign for her through SWAT Behind Bars. She's on our advisory board, and she's in prison. And I wish that she were here to speak about all of these intersectional issues and how we need to be bringing them all to the forefront. She's a black trans woman and a black trans woman of color, and incredibly problematic issues around her case, and she's now in prison. And these are the kind of issues that we need to be bringing to the attention again and again and again. And if anyone wants to write her a letter, please let me know. I'll give you her address.
Thank you. Go ahead, Cynthia.
Okay, so a couple of things. First, in terms of this idea of the UN hasn't been able to enforce human rights, was the question in relation to the UDHR? Yes. Okay, so a quick clarification. A lot of people who I work with beat up on the UN. And, you know, the UN doesn't do this and the UN doesn't do that. However, I want to argue that the United Nations can only be as strong as the governments within it let it be. Okay? The UN's budget is in large part from donations from governments, and then just, you know, carry this on, right? Governments don't like to be criticized. Governments don't necessarily, you know, they don't like to be told what to do. Governments are, you know, governments. It's states and power. Anyway, all this to say that the UN could be a much more efficient set of systems. It's not just one thing. There are many UN agencies. So the UN itself doesn't have the enforcement power. It can't enforce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or other treaties, right? It's government's responsibility to do that enforcement. So that's one piece. In terms of steps possibly to take, let's look at US examples. I was going to talk about this toward closing, but I'll bring this example, I'll bring it forward. Under this administration, and under the Bush administration too, the US government has made decisions to defund UNFPA, which is the agency that focuses on reproductive rights and population development and a lot of health issues. So the US Congress allocates a certain amount of funding to support UNFPA, just as other governments, parliaments do those things. The US made a decision to defund UNFPA because of an old rehashed set of lies about UNFPA supporting abortion in China. All right, this was a set of arguments that came up under the Bush administration. It's been completely debunked, and that appeared again under Trump administration. We're out of UNFPA. They've pulled funding from the World Health Organization. They have pulled out of the Human Rights Council. I'll say more about this in closing. But you can see that Congress, under this current administration and under Moscow Mitch, is making decisions to pull resources from the very UN systems that are set up to help to protect rights. So this is one entry point for us to say, you know what, we're actually not going to stand for that because we want the support for the funding and the resources. That's one small entry point. It's, but an important one. That's another piece. Same answer for the second question about what to do with limited resources. A quick piece on this, shift your messaging. Shift your messaging. Read some of the UN main human rights documents and build messaging about what you care most about using some of that language. Doesn't cost anything.
There are booklets on everyone's table of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or there should be. If there aren't, let me know.
The Universal Periodic Review, which is the UN mechanism that we referred to earlier, coming up in 2020, which happens every 5 years, where countries review the US, is one of the reasons I think it's so important, even more so in my view than some of the treaty reviews, is because it's the only real opportunity we have to lift up issues that are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but that the US has not ratified in terms of treaties, right? So again, I talked about the US purposefully ignoring economic and social rights, which are some of the issues many of us care about most and are at the core of inequality and injustice in this country: housing, work, education, healthcare. These rights are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. One, I want to give yourselves a round of applause if you know what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is. You're ahead of the game in this country. We don't have formalized human rights education in this country. That's another thing I'm passionate about that some other countries in Latin America and Europe and elsewhere have, like math and science. We could have human rights education. But the Universal Periodic Review looks at the totality of a human rights record of a country, including this. And so even though we've ignored ratification in treaty, legally binding form, and this is aspirational, it's an opportunity to do advocacy and call the US out around all of our issues that are in here.
How do you raise the issue of human rights? How do you even begin to talk to someone about it? I was in Florida during the fight for marriage equality. If you know Florida, yes, yes, it is not a state that is friendly to the things we care about, or the people in the state are not. And I was with a legislator, and I was talking about the fact that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says that every human being has a right to form family. The United Nations has consistently refused to limit family by trying to define it. The legislator was incredulous and asked if I had a copy of the book. I handed him the little pamphlet RJ was holding up, and he read it, sitting right there. We were at a cocktail party because it was Florida. He read it cover to cover. And he said, I don't see anything in here about gay people having the right to marry. And I said, this is about human rights. Are you telling me you don't believe that gay people are human beings? Okay, so we're not friends today. But the conversation moved him on the issue. Didn't move him a lot, but it did move him. In a conversation last night with Nadine Smith, one of our 2019 Vicky Sexual Freedom Award recipients, yes, Nadine said, sometimes we're so focused on this gigantic ultimate goal that we don't see the small victories that we have along the way, changing one person's mind, putting human rights into one conversation, raising the issue in one powerful, socially laden moment, like the DC court on prostitution-free zones. They're small steps. You can't say, okay, now there's no issue around human rights violations in DC, but you can say that there are no prostitution-free zones, because that's the truth. I want to do one more question and make sure I have enough time for all of you to make your remarks. Is there currently any process for sex workers to safely report assault or robbery? What about undocumented workers? Which one of you wants to jump in on that? My answer was no, but more nuanced answers.
Well, I talked earlier about the state of California, and they just passed, the governor signed into law that there is immunity for sex workers if they are the victim of a crime, can come forward and have immunity. And I think that these immunity laws, we're looking at them, Florida actually was looking at one regarding drug use, right? We're trying to get these immunity laws, which is a really good way, Cynthia said, shift the conversation, that if we can shift the message and say, how can we, and so I would use California as a model. I haven't read all of the details of that legislation, but I would use that as a model. I think the immunity laws that we are trying to put into place around the country for people who are using drugs, and they may be connected with someone who's dying and they're afraid to call the authorities because they're going to get arrested. So we're trying to create immunity laws, and I think that has human rights at its framework. Ricky's short answer is relatively true, but there are places where these conversations are happening, and if we can put the onus and the respect on the individual life, the human life, that may or may not be participating in criminalized behavior, we can start pushing that conversation forward. And I think, again, I try to look at like the mainstream audience, the mainstream of the US. Can we just come to an agreement that these lives matter? These people matter, and so if we're going to have laws that prevent them, or criminal whatever, prevent them from saving lives, from reporting a crime and finding someone who's habitually creating crimes, perpetuating crimes against people, we need to be able to have that conversation, and I think the majority of people can get behind that, which is what we need our country to do, to talk to legislators and demand these kind of immunity laws. Now, when it comes to having documents, people who have documents, people who do not have documents, that is a whole other question, and it's a really scary question. And RJ actually had some thoughts on this earlier, so I'm actually going to turn it over to one of you brilliant people on that one, because it's really scary.
No, I had no brilliant thoughts. I just feel it's an unsafe time for undocumented folks to interface with any state agency, even in localities that have been supposedly safe. We know that whether they're sanctuary cities or what have you, that there have been instances where information has been shared with federal authorities that should not have been, and so yeah, the lawyer in me definitely cautions anyone who's undocumented from interfacing with law enforcement without, seeking counsel. Like, for example, we do mostly immigration and asylum-related work at the Sex Workers Project on our legal team. So in your locale, if there are knowledgeable sex worker-friendly or migrant rights-friendly lawyers or organizations, I'm sure they exist wherever you live. We can always be a resource to help you find those folks and get you connected with at least good counsel, good advice before interfacing with the state. Of course, a lot of people have to interface with the state, with law enforcement, in a coercive way, in a way that they're not choosing to come forward and do. That happens with street-based workers every day. And so I think with that, it really, really depends a lot on the individual officer you're dealing with and their sort of approach and the discretion that they wield or not, or choose to not. For example, in New York, we have an LGBT officers, I forget the name of it, but the LGBT police officers have been actually quite helpful in getting us access to the larger NYPD in order to train folks up on engaging with street-based workers, not objectifying workers, not perpetuating violence unintentionally against workers. And so if you live in bigger cities, there's sometimes wings of law enforcement that may not be completely safe, but may be a harm reduction approach.
I'm gonna jump in and actually say something positive, except for the fact that it doesn't exactly respond to the question in terms of U.S. So generally I agree. I think the climate is extremely risky for sex workers, for undocumented people generally. Okay, so that's a given. What I will say is within the UN system, there is an increasing trend toward sex worker organizing and visibility around sex work concerns, and that has changed in the last 5 years. It's changed in the last 10 years. This is the positive part. It doesn't speak to individual cases within the United States, right? That's not my entry point. I'm speaking more broadly. There is a level of engagement and articulation and analysis that is undeniable. And some of us in the human rights universe talk about how human rights, it's fluid, it shifts. 20 years ago, we weren't necessarily talking about the human right to water, right, or the human right to food. These are givens now within the human rights universe. Anyway, point being, the analysis develops, and we are in a moment where sex work-related concerns are moving from a site of relative invisibility to moments of visibility in a way that's actually really promising. And I would encourage folks to help amplify that trend. For those of you who are doing that specific kind of organizing, there are ways to keep that information flowing into the UN system.
I just want to add echo that in the sense that the fact that sex workers' rights, prostitution, laws, and all of that have actually entered into our presidential conversation is incredible. Just within the last year. And I think that has a lot to do with, the discourse around trafficking. And so again, when we can take this thing like trafficking, which is this huge, enormous thing, but we can shift it to human rights and to say decriminalization of prostitution is actually going to help us find and help victims of trafficking. It's actually going to help us. So if we can shift those conversations, and the fact that now presidential candidates are actually being taken to task and say, well, where do you stand on decrim? Where do you stand? And then we have to educate them on what decriminalization actually means, which is not the Nordic model or in demand. But again, the fact that we're actually being able to have these conversations is incredibly positive. And the press is picking this up. Rolling Stone is picking this up. It's like incredible, right?
We've been, just in the past year, I want to echo that, had opportunities to be in Marie Claire, like very mainstream, not likely suspect publications. We're talking this week to MTV and HBO. It's the media visibility, and we think sometimes about culture change versus law and policy change. And I think they have to go hand in hand. It's not necessarily one before the other. Destigmatization and humanization of us as workers and as humans has to happen along with policy change. And I don't know that you can have one without the other. And I think why this has happened is in part because of Sesta Fosta, however you say it. I think that even terrible things, right, can can have good outcomes, and one of the positive outcomes of a very terrible legislative move that harms so many people is media visibility. And I think that it's on us to make sure that they get it right, to make sure our stories are told appropriately and respectfully. But I've seen a window of opportunity to really show the diversity of who sex workers are and to humanize us and destigmatize us in mainstream media.
For anyone who isn't aware, the piece of legislation that RJ is referencing, actually it's two pieces and smooshed together, to become Sesta Fosta. It is, I can't even find the words to tell you how terrible and frightening this piece of legislation is. If this piece of legislation stands, we are headed down a road of complete censorship of anything sexual, of anything having to do with pleasure, gender identity. It will end freedom of speech. And that's why Woodhull is the lead plaintiff on the suit, the federal suit, challenging this piece of unconstitutional legislation. Thank you. The name of the lawsuit is, I love to say this, Woodhull Freedom Foundation versus the United States of America. There's information about that on our website, under our work.
I want to say something about Sesta Fosta. I think that, and echo what RJ said in terms of this terrible legislation, which is about criminalizing online communication about potentially sex trafficking, but it's incredibly broad, as Ricky references. It has galvanized, as did the election of our current president, has galvanized feelings about we need to do something, which has been incredible. I think there's been a lot of middle-of-the-road people who are just like, yeah, whatever. And now they're like, we have to do something. And I would say, I used to be afraid of the press, very much afraid, as an academic, as a researcher, as a whatever I am. I was afraid they would twist my words, but I have to tell you that if you can get your message or whatever it is, your language, and talk about the human rights or whatever it is, I speak to any reporter who wants to talk to me, and I'm very clear with them about the message and what it is, and I'm not as afraid anymore. And I think we really, and of course I have a hell of a lot of privilege, don't get me wrong, right? But I could also potentially lose my job because, you know, I get misquoted or whatever. So I think that if we can speak out as much as possible, and I have a lot of cultural privilege, right? But if we can all speak out, and I know sex workers, I was testifying with sex workers in the state of Florida, and they're standing up and they're saying, I'm Kristen Kane, I'm a sex worker, and this law is a problem. And that takes a fucking lot of courage, right? And I'm just so impressed by that, by those people that are willing to stand up and say, you need to listen to me. And they are quoted in mainstream publications. And that is what we need to be doing as individuals to the extent that we can, to take the risks that we can take, because not everyone can take those risks.
Thank you. I'm being mindful of time. So how about if you each offer some comments in the order that I forget? Who was first? For final comments.
Who was first in terms of the first run through?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was first.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay, this is going to be a series of sort of discordant thoughts. First, some challenges in addressing, well, some challenges in terms of doing human rights related work right now, particularly in the U.S. First, the United States hates the human rights system. There's very little political will to support it. I flagged pulling funding. Let me say this a little bit, well, I'm going to be as opinionated. I think there's no need to tone that down. The U.S. is engaging in an effort to dismantle and weaken the UN human rights system, like full stop. It's true for other governments as well. I mentioned those examples. I want to tease this out. The U.S. pulled out of, it gave up its membership in the UN Human Rights Council last year. And it did that, there are, I think, 40-ish members of the Human Rights Council. And, sorry, I'm just going to go off on this tangent because I think it's important for you to know. This was under Nikki Haley. Don't be fooled by her. Don't be fooled. She's not some, soft liberal. She's not a liberal conservative, right? She was horrible, right? As U.S. ambassador to the UN, she was horrible. So when the U.S. pulled out of the Human Rights Council under her stewardship, although chances are it was John Bolton who directed her to do that, or it could have been Steve Bannon, who knows, because she was a neophyte in that system. As they were pulling out, on State Department letterhead and over the signature of Nikki Haley, they wrote a letter to about 22 NGOs, some of which are based in the U.S., non-governmental organizations. That letter was scathing. It ended up going public, and it was a letter that basically said, you, because of your work, and these were NGOs, imagine this, that focused on LGBT issues, that focused on gender, that focused on rights related to abortion. There were mainstream human rights organizations as well. They targeted these organizations, and this letter basically said, because of your unwillingness to work with the US government in our efforts to reform the UN, and I put that in, I want to say quotation marks, but I only have one hand free, so, okay, so there's another one over here. It was disgusting, it was completely coercive. There's more to say about that story, but they used the vehicle of NGOs acting out to justify, in part, the U.S. decision to come out of the Human Rights Council, which was bullshit. And it was extraordinary and a marker of attacks on NGOs and organizing. I didn't mean to take that long to tell that story, but forgive me, I think it's important for you to know. Right-wing NGOs have taken root in the UN, both in Geneva and in New York, at the Commission on the Status of Women, where I've gone for the last 18 years. The organizations that RJ mentioned, in addition, others, Citizen Go, a gross anti-gay, anti-abortion, anti-trans organization, hired a bus this year that had images posted on the side. It was an anti-trans messaging. Last year it was a fetus, and the bus drives around the UN while this meeting takes place. It's remarkable. So there's a climate of harassment. Within the UN itself, the United States is striking where it can in resolutions and in negotiations with other governments. It's striking the language of rights. It wants to eliminate the word gender and replace that term with the word sex. It's anti-feminist, it's anti-trans, it's against everything that we've been arguing for the last, I don't know how many decades in terms of how we understand gender. But literally, the United States, along with other countries, is engaging in an effort to strike the words, right? Strike gender, strike the term rights. As recently as, I don't know, it was like 2 months ago in the UN, in the Security Council, they were negotiating a resolution on sexual violence and conflict, and there was language in the draft that would have provided services to survivors of sexual abuse and conflict. It would have provided sexual and reproductive health services, and the U.S. effort meant that clause came out. So in the Security Council, on a resolution on sexual abuse and conflict, on rights of survivors, they took out, because of U.S. influence, language that would have called upon governments to provide sexual and reproductive health services. There are efforts in the Human Rights Council on the protection of the family, right? I don't have to say more about that. You know what I mean. Same thing as here, right? Same thing as the domestic concern. But these are efforts launched by Russia, by Egypt, with U.S. support. There's also a resolution that keeps appearing on promotion of traditional values. All of this manipulated by right-wing NGOs and by governments that support them. I'm going to jump toward closing. there are really positive trends within the UN system and the human rights system. RJ flagged the language of bodily autonomy. Upward trend in terms of governments that are willing to support language on bodily autonomy. Rights of intersex people. I flagged the growth, food, water, right to development. Those are more historic. Rights of indigenous peoples on the upswing. Rights of older people on the upswing. What you can do, use the recommendations that exist already. Read some of these documents, the UDHR, other conventions on civil and political rights, social and economic rights. There are about 10 treaties. These are supposed to be legally binding, right? Read the language. You will find yourself in that language. It will not be hard. It will not be hard for you. Integrate that language into your messaging. Do the creative campaigning. Do the legal work. If you can, and any of us would be happy to talk more about this, work with the special rapporteurs to help them build the analysis, contribute to the UPR reviews or the reviews of the different treaty bodies. We didn't talk much about those, but that's important because their work is supposed to be legally binding as well. And I'll simply close by saying I think it's imperative that we use a human rights lens to challenge this administration. We have to throw the book at this administration with every tool we have available, including using human rights language, challenge this administration around issues of genocide, around issues of war crimes, including in relation to closing the camps at the U.S. border, where I would argue that the child separation policy rises to the legal definition of torture, right? We all use the term torture pretty loosely, but there is a legal definition of that term which implies political intent, and there's clearly political intent directed towards the families and other people who might make choices to migrate or not. So there's no reason not to use the human rights system and to, yes, fine, vote these bastards out of office, but bring them up on charges of genocide and torture and war crimes in the interim too.
Thank you so much. Jill.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate it, and I also I want to thank Woodhull. Cynthia said a lot of amazing things, and I'm not going to repeat many of what she said. I'm actually going to, I think, be pretty short, which probably you guys would appreciate. No offense. I've had an interesting experience this week at this conference. Woodhull is an incredible space. I haven't been here in many years. It's been really wonderful to come back, and I am so grateful that that we have had the Sex Worker Institute. I've also experienced a lot of pain, and I know that some of this came out of the Sex Worker Institute with trans women of color sex workers, also people that are just trying to work through whatever they're trying to work through. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of pain. And all I want to say is within the human rights framework, I'm sometimes shocked that we are not treating each other better as humans. We are in a human rights conference, a sexual freedom conference, and I would just say, I really want us to, me included, to be kind to each other and to expect the best from each other. We expect the worst from those assholes on Capitol Hill, but we've got to, and I'm not trying to preach, I'm just saying that this has been a painful week for many, many people, and this is the place where we get to be together and learn from each other and love each other and not hurt each other. And so I just really want to bring that back. If we can't be humans together and fight for our rights, what are we going to do out there? So that's all.
Thank you. Thank you. RJ is going to speak, but I don't want to take a chance on missing someone who's in this room. Woodhull's name is on that federal lawsuit, but there's someone in the room who put her own name as a plaintiff. Please, a round of applause for Alex Andrews. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for your courage, for what you do every day, whatever that is, to advance human rights in your own way, shape, and form. I don't believe in coincidence, and so what Jill just said astounded me because I just could not agree more. I know I keep naming the years I've been in these movements, but it's because, it's been a progression. It's really been a journey of how my own politicization, how I see our movements function. And over these couple of decades, I've gone from being a very angry activist to being one who is more compassionate, I think, and more hope-filled, despite how bad things are. That's my personal journey, but I just want to share that because I think anger only gets us so far. I think we treat each other very poorly much of the time in our organizations and movements. And I think there's perhaps what people would say good reason, right? Trauma being one of them. But we have to do better. There is, the past 2 years for me have been probably the most painful in terms of doing movement work. I've left the movement at large a couple of times, once to be a personal trainer, once to do sex work full time, because I just couldn't with the infighting and the problems with the nonprofit industrial complex. So many things, right? But it keeps pulling me back, and it being human rights work. And so I just want to really second that if we cannot love one another and be kind to one another, there's a real problem, and we have to do our best, whatever that means. I want to say lastly that I think that we can get so caught up in our own pain that we cause pain to one another without knowing it, right? And that as an anti-oppression trainer and anti-oppression activist, I have not changed my mind one iota about the systems of oppression and white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. I use those words intentionally, that exist. And I think that the human rights framework tells us everyone has value. Everyone has value. No one is the worst thing they've ever done. And we're all more than the worst of ourselves. And so I challenge us all, myself included, to see the best in one another, and to keep trying to have compassion, not just for people we like, not just for people who agree with us, right? We have to really strive to stop with putting each other in boxes, because we're whole humans. Thank you.
Thank you. So, pardon me? No, of course you may.
I just want to say really quickly, and I think we have to keep pushing ourselves. I know Woodhull has continued to push themselves, accessibility issues, sex worker institutes. So we're pushing ourselves and opening ourselves. It's uncomfortable, but pushing ourselves and being kind to each other is going to get us much further.
Thank you. So what can you all do? We wanted to send you home. Well, we didn't want to send you home at all. But recognizing that you will have to at some point depart the hotel, what can you each do in your lives that will further the human rights framework? Well, you've heard some very specific things from our amazing panelists. And remember I told you about how one little thing is still progress. So I'm going to build on what you've said. I'm going to tell you all that the resources that are listed there, and pardon me, that will be on the website, on the Woodhull website, familiarize yourselves with the language, with the documents, with the treaties, with the rights that we have, which really are all the rights. And look at the person next to you and know that they're a human being, just like you. That's something you can do, and you can begin doing it right now. We can call in instead of calling out. We can accept effort instead of criticizing lack. We can treat each other as human beings. And you can come back next year, the first weekend in August, to the 2020 Sexual Freedom Summit. And I thank our panel. I invite you all to look at some photos from this past week as we say our goodbyes, which I always hate to do. It has been 10 wonderful years. Thank you all so much.